Of the many super bosses to feature through Final Fantasy's history, Final Fantasy VII's Emerald Weapon undoubtedly ranks among the most memorable. Being the groundbreaking game that it was, Final Fantasy VII opened up the games to new audiences, and so for many, Emerald Weapon was an introduction to JRPG super bosses. But why, in such a comparatively feature-rich and optional boss-rich game, does Emerald Weapon stand distinct for so many? What elements set it apart from its contemporaries when there are more difficult foes across the series, and arguably within Final Fantasy VII itself? And does Emerald Weapon and others have a future in the Final Fantasy VII chronology, owing to the changing depictions of the creatures in the remake era? Jumping right in, Emerald Weapon, like most weapons in Final Fantasy VII, is broadcast quite candidly to the player. They are an element of the core story that erupt from the northern crater, and thereafter feature in cool cutscenes such as at Junon, and dot about the overworld as creatures that we can fight against. So very unlike the optional super bosses of other games, where we have the weapon of Final Fantasy VIII, which is hidden deep in the Deep Sea Research Center, or the Omega weapon of Final Fantasy X, which is hidden in the coordinates of the world map in the Omega Ruins. As such, the weapons of Final Fantasy VII as super bosses are much easier to encounter and get involved with, owing to their obviousness in the game. Now, for its part, Emerald Weapon is one of the most frustratingly, and dare I say, terrifyingly obvious of these creatures, owing to how it randomly patrols quite a confined and awkward to navigate area of the world map, which is the underwater sections that we can explore by submarine. And for anyone that's played the original Final Fantasy VII, I'm sure we've all had moments where we go around a corner that we can't really see, or perhaps even we load up a save, and as soon as we drop down underwater, out of the murk looms Emerald Weapon, forcing us into a futile encounter. Often, even staying stationary underwater can see it incidentally collide with us, and so it's quite a memorable, panic-inducing aspect of the game that was equal parts funny, sometimes terrifying, and frustrating. And this leads us on to the next point, which is Emerald Weapon's repute eclipsing that of the other bosses in the game, and specifically, I think, Ruby Weapon. Now, while each of these are challenging bosses, and they are probably the two toughest bosses in the game, Ruby Weapon is arguably the tougher of the two, and yet it is Emerald Weapon that players remember more. And once more, I put this largely down to the aforementioned obvious appearance and threat of these incidental encounters that you have with Emerald Weapon underwater. By comparison, Ruby Weapon features much more discreetly on the overworld as this odd red fin that moves about in the desert of the Gold Saucer, and this is not a location that the player really needs to encounter or go to by any necessity towards the end of the game. The Deep Sea section has a wealth of things to explore. We have the Sunken Gelnika, where we encounter the Turks for another optional boss battle. We have the route that takes us through to Lucrecia's cave to build up the story of Vincent and unlock stuff for him. And so the odds of encountering Emerald Weapon by pure chance are that much higher. In terms of comparison between Emerald and Ruby, there is also the argument that a player's mastery of character building with materia is much higher for Emerald, and there are prerequisite objectives such as gaining the underwater materia to remove the countdown timer and so on one must do before they really want to enter that battle with a chance. But again, that's a back and forth debate that goes on between Emerald and Ruby. Next, and in keeping with location, there is something about the ominous, silent Emerald Weapon lurking in the depths that make it so memorable. It completely contradicts the ambient, peaceful underwater theme of the game. It has no sound effects or anything to notify the player that it's nearby, and perhaps owing to the limited graphics of 1997, which limited the field of view, its potential to just materialise out of the darkness at the last minute made it quite a terrifying feature, and where I've discussed this admittedly quite personal intrigue and fear about unknown things in the deep, when I discussed Final Fantasy X's Sin quite a while ago, which is a comparable creature to Emerald Weapon in some respects, and I put this largely down to being forced to watch the 1960s marionette show Stingray when I was a kid, which gave me a permanent fear of underwater creatures. Emerald Weapon has this similar vibe to Sin. It is this unknowable behemoth that roams beneath the world, inspired, I think, by a uniquely Japanese blend of both the Keiju subgenre and Gundam mechs, which make it all the more unique and menacing in terms of design. And this leads me on to another final, but perhaps still quite subjective point, which is that Emerald Weapon has a pretty unique design, even among the other Gundam-inspired weapons of Final Fantasy VII. There is something about its organic green hue and its stout, compact design that sets it apart from the other dragon-esque beings that roam the world. It's menacing in part because it's so unassuming. It has neither the angry features of Sapphire Weapon or the conventional dragon shape of Ultima Weapon. It's just this weird thing floating around beneath the waves. So definitely impactful, definitely memorable in this small inclusion it had in the original game. And finally, I think the question remains, and has been speculated upon quite a lot, as to whether Emerald Weapon, and indeed the other iterations of the weapon creatures, will feature in the remake saga in their former depictions. Now, some players have been quick to note that Emerald Weapon, and Ruby Weapon in particular, did not feature in the original Japanese release of Final Fantasy VII, but came in the international and later editions. Plus, as we have seen from Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, weapons have tended to be depicted as more docile whale creatures that look more like Sin from Final Fantasy X than anything we've seen in the original games. But nonetheless, neither of these points necessarily discount the potential to see the more menacing super bosses from the original game featured in the final installment of Final Fantasy VII Remake. I would be more surprised if they were omitted as a super boss, or at least kind of looking like they originally did, owing to, as we've touched on here, how memorable and impactful and the challenge and reward that these weapon creatures offered in the original game. So there we have it, a brief look back at Emerald Weapon, one of the biggest challenges of Final Fantasy VII, and one that, for a number of reasons, still looms large in the mind of players. It's representative for many of the challenge and reward of Final Fantasy VII, representative more broadly of super bosses across the Final Fantasy series. Personally, it gives me this hint of endgame depression as well. That final third of a Final Fantasy game, you've done all of the side quests and you're just left with that one difficult thing to contend with. Emerald Weapon tends to represent that for me, and it makes me feel quite sad because these rich, wonderful stories are kind of drawing to a close. The worlds feel suddenly empty, and I don't really like it. But nonetheless, fantastic aspect of Final Fantasy VII. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.